Hello. Hello, how's everyone doing? Happy? Yes. More happy? Yes. Hey, there you are. And how many AI ChatGPT talks have you already been to? 3. Yeah, quite a few. I'm amazed this got selected because I was going, there's a load of other stuff that seems exactly the same. It must be my clickbait did the job. Because I've seen Adam Kogan and I saw Martin Mazur yesterday, so I stole 2 little bits from theirs that I didn't know about, which is good. So this is if I only had a hammer, and clearly the joke is if you only have a hammer, everything's a nail. Right? So there you are. Well, that's the point. Well, the interesting bit here is a load of people tried to submit talks to NDC this year that generated them with AI and ChatGPT. Right? There was at least 500 apparently, and I'm not going to tell you what the tells are because otherwise you can't get rid of them very quickly. But there's one really clear thing in titles that is a giveaway. So yes, and they're all so positive, which means they're not real developers. Okay, so did I have AI help with this presentation? Unfortunately, at the last minute I did, right? Because I wanted to put that picture into my PowerPoint. So I inserted it in PowerPoint, and PowerPoint has something that helps with accessibility. It suggests alternative text for pictures. And it suggested that this is a hammer hitting a nail, right? Which is, as Niles already pointed out, not a nail, it's a screw. Which obviously, when I inserted that picture, it told me it was a green screw in a wood surface. So it knew it was a screw then, but it didn't know it was a screw when there was a hammer near it, which says a lot about AI. So what this talk is not. So the aim of this talk, does anyone know what these are? Well, the wooden clogs, they're from a part of Europe called Brittany. Does anyone know what the name of a clog in Brittany would be? No? It's a sabot. And the original weavers who used to weave at home hated the jacquard loom so much, they started smashing them up. And they went and coined the term saboteur and sabotage because of the clog they wore. Apparently it wasn't because they put it in the frame, it's because the clogs were so noisy they would make the same noise as an industrial loom. In the UK at the same time, we had someone called Ned Ludd who smashed looms, and that's why we have the word Luddite. So what this is not is a Luddite talk saying everything about AI is crap, everything about Copilot is crap, but we need to consider where we are and how we should use it. So there's a little mini history about Copilot and the history of it. So first launched into Visual Studio Code. Then the next place you could get it was JetBrains, probably for Rider, I assume. And then it came to Visual Studio because, you know, Visual Studio is always last in all the new stuff now. And it was initially powered by the OpenAI codecs. Everyone knows that as GPT-3. It got to GPT-4 last November. I was in Adam's talk. He talked about GTP4 Turbo, GTP4o. It may have changed since, but that's a rough history. And it's based on public data. If anyone thought, why did Microsoft buy GitHub? At the time, there were 2 things people said. They wanted to encourage the open source community to buy into Microsoft, right? And, you know, the other one was that GitHub needed money to keep going, and it wouldn't necessarily it needed someone to help fund it. But the other thing that people said at the time was they now have access to a massive amount of code base that they can leverage to do IntelliSense and things like that. And what they did was plug it into OpenAI. And that's where Copilot's coming from. And Nat Friedman say in June, well, training on the ML systems in public data is fair use. And just swept away all the issues to do with it's our code, it's copyright. Even if it's public, it's copyright. The tricky bit is when Copilot absolutely verbatim churns out the same code that someone had in their repository, it's a bit dodgy, right? But it is giving a huge wealth of data for the model to train on. But before I go launch straight into Copilot, we need to go back in time. Right? Because this isn't new, and it's not new in like software engineering. We have been using tools for thousands of years. Until I did this presentation, I didn't realize wheels are only 5,000 years old. Like 5,000 years ago, someone went, if we put this round thing on a stick and put it under a truck, it goes faster than me walking with it on animals. Right? Unbelievably, about 1,000 years later, they went, and if we make it spokes, it's lighter, and it has a bit of suspension, and it works much better. So they invented spokes about 1,000 years later, and they didn't put a patent on it. Patent, if you're American. And we didn't have an industrial revolution until the end of the 1700s. So we're 250 years into non-human or animal power, where water and steam really went in and speeded everything up. So they changed how we live. Wheels meant we could move larger things and have trade. Water power and steam power created factories. Everyone moved from the countryside into factories to work there, changed how they lived. A lot of people say, my God, these people were nice and having a good life in the countryside, and then they worked in horrible factories, which are hellish and dark and dismal. Some people mistake the fact that when you lived in the countryside at the time of the Industrial Revolution, if there was no work, you starved. So the factories were actually a better solution than not being paid in the countryside at that point in England. And with software development, we're used to tooling to make us more productive. The tooling that everyone is using is probably an IDE. There's very few people left writing stuff in Notepad. Right, there might be a few here. Who still uses Notepad every day to write code? Nope, no one. Okay, so you're using a tool every day, an IDE. So we've always had these tools. Started out with things like higher level languages, so we don't have to program in machine code. Then we program in assembly, and then we got real languages. And then we got compilers that could do syntax checking at compile time. I started work on computers on a BBC Micro. It was a single file. It was either basic or it had assembly language in it, and I learned 60502 assembly. And the first IDE I ever used was Ball and Turbo Pascal at university in a work placement. And it was amazing because you could have multiple files and compile them as one thing. And you got breakpoints and debugging. This was amazing. I wasn't just having to print things to a screen, you know? And the IDE got better. Visual Basic came along, showed you how you could have graphical designers. So now we've got a tool that stops us having to worry about how it really works under the hood, and we can just plug buttons on there and put code behind it. So these are really important. And Copilot is just a new tool we have in our armory, and it lives inside one of the oldest tools we have, the IDE, whichever IDE you're using, whether it's IntelliJ, Rider, Visual Studio Code, Eclipse. That still exists, does it? For some poor people. You know, every IDE is really good. They add more and more stuff, more add-ins. It becomes bloated, and someone has to rewrite it as a slimmed-down, faster version eventually. So Visual Studio Code will eventually be, it's too big. There's no way I can cope with Visual Studio Code anymore. But we have a responsibility with these tools, and this is where I start being philosophical or ranty. Tools are not about creating code faster. We should look at them as ways to increase our code quality. We should deliver benefits for end users. That's what our software does, and we can deliver more with those tools, but we're still delivering stuff for end users. We reduce the boring code, hopefully, and we get to do the interesting bits. You know, it'd be nice. And controversially, with anyone higher than my role as head of engineering, you provide interesting work for developers so their job is satisfying, because you shouldn't be employing people who don't like their job and really just clock off and want to go home. So you want to give them a satisfying job and make it intellectually stimulating. More importantly, we write code that really affects people's lives. So at the risk of people going, you've mentioned his name. At the original NDC London, Uncle Bob, I mentioned his name, right, did a talk about how we have a responsibility as software developers. This is 10 years ago type stuff. As software developers to write good code, quality code that's reliable. And his comments were, we're programming light switches, we're programming light bulbs, we're programming insulin releases in your own body. we're programming cars, all sorts of things. So we're actually materially affecting people's lives. And you think, he's quite right, you know, the code we do, we're not a we still, how many people here really have a professional kind of certification, like a chartered engineer, chartered accountant? Is anyone a chartered something in software, or did we all kind of learn ourselves? There, you might have IEEE, there you are. But there's hardly anyone has kind of really solid foundations. So we do have a responsibility because we've took it on ourselves not to kind of monitor ourselves too heavily. And all this sounded scaremongering and stuff, and then Boeing, Max, yeah, that was software, it killed lots of people. Like, that's what software did when it goes wrong and stops the humans doing what they needed to do and crashes planes. And that was because we've been a bit flippant about software development. Well, the management at Boeing were particularly flippant about how they did software development. So your code could be critical. It could kill people. It could make their lives financially impossible. It could be the post office in the UK. And you may not know this, but in the UK, we prosecuted hundreds of post office managers because Fujitsu, an IT company, allowed their support engineers to edit the records on their systems without telling them remotely, and it looked like the people who ran the post office were committing fraud. And they were taken to court and put in prison and killed themselves on the stress. And it was all because the IT support guys used to edit their accounts records and actually adjust their ledgers. So it looked like they'd lost money. And it's taken 20 years for that to come out. And it's going to cost the UK government billions of pounds, like 12, 13 billion pounds in compensation. And that was because the IT company didn't want to admit there were errors in their software. So we've got to make sure that tools that we use don't change these concerns. So I was thinking about how I could kind of paraphrase tools. And I think I mentioned Conway's law in the abstract. So is everyone familiar with Conway's law? Yeah, anyone? Anyone? Bueller? So he pretty much said, the way your organization is arranged will probably cause you to develop your software that mirrors your organization, or the way you construct your software will end up reorganizing your company to match how your software is developed. So think about this. If you have a monolith, you can have a team of 10 programmers all working on it, slamming away. The moment it becomes microservices, you're probably going to divide into 3, 4 teams. Each team's responsible for certain bits of the system. And the reason is because you've designed the software differently, you're now designing how the people work on it differently. And the same thing, I think, happens with tools. We could probably come up with better wording than this, because I came up with this on Monday. So anyone has better wording than this, tell me, and we'll update it. But developers who create systems will be influenced to maximize the facets of the systems that are more easily created with the tools they are using. Right? That's pretty much what I'm saying, is if we are not careful, the tools change how we code significantly and not always for the better. So, and it's really hard to ignore this. So I thought, rather than just put everything onto Copilot, we'll go back to a few tools that the .NET ecosystem is used, because that's where I come from, my Microsoft world, .NET ecosystem, and talk about them. So, first of all, there's mocking frameworks. Who has used a mocking framework? Yes, so of course you have. So there's a load of them for .NET. There's mock-Q, or mock, nmock, and substitute. And the idea is, we can focus on the unit test rather than the classes in question. You can prototype classes that don't exist. It's quicker to use mocking frameworks than to write your own mock object. So we can say, there's a person here, it should do this. We'll get a mock object so that if we say load person 20, it'll always return the name Liam, and therefore we're OK that we know it works. The problem with that is I've used them because other people have used them. Whereas I've always written my own mocks and stubs by hand. And if you write your own mocks and stubs by hand, it's slow, right? It's slower. But you are actually performing software design as you write your mocks. That tends to happen because you're thinking about how it works. Is that really how it should work? Makes it much easier. And there's the concept of this mythical unit test, where someone has used mocking objects so much that there is no concrete class left in the unit test. right? And you go, I know people talk about this, I've never seen it, it's a unicorn, it's blah, blah, it's this kind of thing. No, I found it at Huddle. I looked at it for at least 20 minutes and went, no, there's no concrete object in here. I'll give it back to the team and ask them where the concrete object is, just to make sure. They spend half an hour on it and go, no, there's just 20 mocks. So they managed to be experts in doing mocks to the level where every object in a test was a mock and nothing real got tested. But their mocks were tested really well. Right. And the problem is, you get really expert in the mocking frameworks to the level where people went, I've used nmock, not mockq, can't we use nmock? And you're going, it's a mock object. You shouldn't care what tool you're using. It's the concept of what you're doing with mocks. So they become experts in it, and then they can write unit tests that have no real stuff in. One of the other things that revolutionized, I think, our development as C# developers was ReSharper. There was also DevExpress CodeRush at the same time. They were battling for which was the best thing in an IDE. I think Oliver Sturm's downstairs, he used to do dev evangelism for CodeRush. He's on one of the stands at DevExpress. The interesting thing about CodeRush was, I think the reason I didn't like CodeRush is it drew loads of big arrows over the screen and it freaked me out. Like, genuinely, that was enough to put me off. So when I went to Huddle, I kind of opened the project and went, I hadn't used ReSharper before, and I looked at this project and went, how the hell do you navigate this? It's got classes all over the place. I mean, lots of classes, lots of interfaces, lots of implementations, lots of unit tests that deal with interfaces and implementation. So I started to realize that the code base now required you to have ReSharper to be able to navigate the code base in Visual Studio. It was actually impossible to navigate it easily. Now in Visual Studio you can, because they introduced all that stuff into Visual Studio so you can roam around the code easier. And it's all because ReSharper would sit on a class and have a little bubble going, oh, you can extract the interface on this. And so you didn't have the effort of typing the extraction of that interface and having to think about whether that was a good idea. You just pressed the button and it did it, right? And that allowed you to do it. And this is a point where everyone was into TDD as well. And TDD, you're going to want to have interfaces because it makes implementing objects that are fake that don't go to a database much easier. So that meant there was lots of inversion of control. They were injecting interfaces into methods and into stuff in order to work. IOC containers that you could only debug if it managed, if you were running them as a Windows service, you couldn't find out why they didn't start because the logger hadn't instantiated yet because the IOC went wrong. So you're having to breakpoint Windows services. That's been sorted. And the latest logging normally gets instantiated really early so that you can definitely log what went wrong in the rest of the IOC chain. But this meant we had code bases where people were passing interfaces into a method where all they wanted was one property on that object. Not only that, they were never going to edit that object. They just wanted to read that one property. That one property was a value type. By doing an interface, they were pushing an entire object into methods. By pushing entire objects into methods, it meant you could edit that object, because that's what it means. And then you get a junior programmer go, but I'll put by val on it, on the object reference. And you go, yeah, you see, by val means you can't change the pointer to a different object, but you can edit everything in the object, because that's what it is, right? That's what the reference means. So you had this thing where methods were getting an object handed in. There was a singleton that could be edited and was locking parts of the code up, while this object's in there, and all it wanted was one property of it that never changed. And that's all because ReSharper was so good at doing interfaces, and the unit test TDD had gone so down the rabbit hole that we ended up with that. It also did optimization, did ReSharper. It sounds like I'm really bashing ReSharper, but to be honest, ReSharper's a great tool, right? Let's be honest. You can convert your for-int loops into for-each loops, and that's because for-eaches are new, and they are the skinny jeans, and you're the old man wearing baggy trousers, right? Pretty much how it works. But it is, if you go into the ReSharper documentation, it does tell you you will get performance issues if you convert everything to for-each. Right, it might be easier to read. You might not get out of off-by-one errors, which kind of loops do encourage that. And it points to a Patrick Smakia blog where he has tested this and can tell you how many times faster it is to do 4 int than 4 each. The interesting bit at the end of that, it goes, so if you install NDPens, this can check it all for you. So that's another tool to fix the things that the other tool's been doing for you. Right. But it is the side consequences of using these kind of tools that make life easier and make things more funky. How many people here are under 30? And how many in the 30 do real SQL, or do they use ORMs? Right, a few of them. But we now have, as senior devs, we're now having to teach people how SQL databases work. Because our ORMs have got them out of the habit of understanding what indexes are, how searches work, how transactions work. I did walk through transactions in SQL Server this week with even a senior dev going, I didn't know that. Great. It's like, these are really cool. The ORMs, I wrote an ORM, so I'm guilty of this. It's still there in SourceForge somewhere. One of the first talks I ever did at a conference. So the point is, when you're doing CRUD and you're doing the first bits of an application, they're really great. You can slap up the pages, edit a user, update a user, create a user, all that kind of stuff. Really cool. If you're really mad, you go code first. What? Right. Don't understand this. Relational databases don't do inheritance. Don't force an inheritance model into a relational database. It's not performant. But anyway, so you can do code first, and that means it makes life easy for the developers and crap for the customer if you have a big database. That's what you're saying is my developer experience of 20 people is more important than the 10,000 people who will use this piece of software, right? But it's good for ramping up a system. And one example I had from Huddle, it's really good because Huddle's kind of got merged and took over and never hardly exists, so I can kind of mention them now, and it's all historic, it's like 8 years ago. They actually loaded an entire user object from a repository in NHibernate in order to go, if user equals null, bang, do this. And they didn't touch anything to do with that user. Not one other property than checking it was null. So they went to a database, looked through thousands of records, binary serialized from SQL, put it into a C# object, put it on a heap on a server, which would have to be garbage collected at some point, because that's what has to happen to those objects when they're not used. All to say, was it there? And I kind of went to them, you know, if I could give you the .NET core libraries, you can execute scalar in SQL and just say, select how many rows have this user. And it will come back with 1. And therefore, you've got a user, or it come back with 0, and you haven't got the user. This is really fast. Requires no serialization, no heap allocation. I could explain it to them in 2 minutes in .NET code. It took about an hour for everyone to work out how to do a projection in NHibernate to do exactly the same thing. The really good thing is EF Core can actually sniff this out, that you're doing this, and stop doing the full load of an object, and can actually solve it. So that's kind of stopped. But things like that just kind of annoy me, because that's what ORMs have done to people. Now, the really nice bit, and I saw this in Adam Kogan's talk, it's kind of not really GitHub Copilot. It's the Microsoft Everything is Now Copilot. So Copilot for SQL Azure DB is actually the kind of SQL Server profiler running in Azure and can tell you, you really ought to have this index, that query's crap, you ought not to do this. If you're going to do a text string search in a table that size, you need a full text index, and can solve all those. So we can help devs who aren't used to SQL create much better SQL, right? So that's a good use of the kind of AI. Where did you used to go to this, apart from some grumpy old senior developer, and they're always busy and grumbly because they haven't had their coffee yet? You went to Stack Overflow. So what's GitHub going to do? Now, although people could copy, they do copy code from Stack Overflow, right? Let's be honest. Stack Overflow has a difference because, in general, the questions are answered by real people. And the answers are corrected by real people. And in fact, the questions get corrected by real people. You didn't really mean to ask that, you meant to ask this. And then someone else will go, he's wrong. So you get multiple solutions that says, hey, this would be better if you do this, but in this case, it probably is better to do this. It depends. You know, it's lovely. It's a typical software answer. How do I do this? Give me a yes, no. Well, it depends. Right? And they're upvoted and downvoted, so you can see how popular it is. And it may be 70% of the people do this, 30% do that, and you can make a measured decision on what you do. Or it's answered by John Skeet, and you do what he says. That's John Skeet's avatar from Stack Overflow. So you think, what's Stack Overflow going to do? If Copilot's just going to answer everything, and people go, well, I've got the answer from Copilot, I don't need multiple answers, because Copilot doesn't generally give you multiple answers easily. It'll just give you the solution. Then they'll just code it. But it's OK, because Stack Overflow has announced to deal with OpenAI, and they're going to give all their data to OpenAI, and OpenAI are giving their technology back so they can answer things better in Stack Overflow. Tricky bit is, if they remove the people from Stack Overflow because everyone's on Copilot, will eventually degrade what the quality of information on Stack Overflow is. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. So what is saying that Stack Overflow is a load of questions asked by real people, answered by real people, discussed and argued by real people. You hope they are real people, and John Skeet, who isn't a real person, as Niall said. He's a superhuman, godlike being, right? What is Copilot compared to Stack Overflow? So Copilot is based on the ChatGPT language model. It's a large language model. What is a large language model? If you summarize it, really dumbass summary that you might have a go at, and this is the Wikipedia version of it, is if I give you a word and a context where that word is, I'll give you a statistical prediction on what is the most likely next word, and then the most likely next word, and the most likely next word. And if you train it on the right data and you give it enough little hints, you end up with it generating code. Right? That's what it does. It says, what is the most popular word after this word? Not how do I really solve how to load a user from a database. It's if I have a user, and it will abstract that to a data record in a database, what's the next word you would do in a code to load it from a SQL Server database? You would go from a table and boom, 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 boom. And it'll start working out what the next word should be. Now, the interesting bit is I was chatting with Hennis at lunch on Tuesday. He was having a break from the workshops, and I was talking about my talk, and I was saying, it's a bit weird because I haven't got a narrative yet, and it's a bit annoying because I'm still working on it. And he was going, well, we're using it in our katas for recruitment. So we have something called the Gilded Rose, which I'd never heard of. It's a kind of little sample application. It's about, now correct me if I'm wrong, but it's about buying artifacts from some kind of magical shop or something like that. Something like that. Buying something, and you can only buy this if you can buy this, and this has so many points or something like that. And they decided to customize it, and the normal names of the shops and the objects were renamed to the coffee shop and the bar around the corner from the office and things that they use. So they customized it to look like their scenario, so it wasn't absolutely the vanilla version of the Gilded Rose. So that was quite cool. So they pushed Copilot at it, and Copilot went, oh yeah, this is the Gilded Rose, and used all the original names from the Gilded Rose instead of the ones they'd changed to, and you had to edit it to push it into the vernacular they'd used in their own sample. So it couldn't grasp the concept that actually that shop is actually this bar name across the road, and everything that happened at that shop should happen in this bar. But the other interesting bit was, he said, all our candidates were pushing their code into public GitHub repos, and that's how we looked at them. He said, now if you look for the Gilded Rose answer on a blank solution, you get the names we put in our code that are local to our office, because there are now more repos with that in than there is of the original example. So Copilot has learnt that the most common thing for that Gilded Rose is to include the bar name opposite Hennis's office, not the name of the original shop. Right. So you think about this and you go, that's really weird, that's really cool, because now it is going for what is the most popular, most commonly used. People are hitting those repos because they're looking at them after the test. So there's a load of people looking at them to check what the code looks like. So I'm going, well, if I was a member of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, which is China, what if I created loads of public GitHub repos with a common solution that we all use? and enough users. Now, they've got lots of people to do this. They can do this. They can like them, they can share them, they can fork them, they can make them really popular. But they put a flaw in to all those repos. And you use Copilot, and you import the code from Copilot, and you don't have a senior dev checking for security issues, and the PLA have now pawned your code through Copilot. And all it's doing is saying, this is the most popular thing. And believe me, the People's Liberation Army can make it the most popular thing in GitHub. And it will be really hard for GitHub to not allow that to happen. And it will be really hard for Copilot to go, oh no, I sniff a rat here. So you know that there's the guy who spent 2 years changing an open source project and doing commits and doing tiny changes and eventually put flaws in but didn't activate them for another load of months. It's that on a way bigger scale. So I was kind of in the photo room going, what if the PLA did? No, they're already doing it. There's no way they're not already doing this. We just don't know. We haven't found out they've done this yet, but they must be doing it. If I've thought of it, they've thought of it. They're much smarter than me, right? There you are. So Dependabot and GitHub Advanced Security may get in there. The other one is have some greybeard in your organization who looks at these codes and goes, that's shite. That's got stuff in that's bad. You know. So the other thing that worried me clearly about, I'm going to do a talk about GitHub Copilot. The team's fed back. They use it for certain things. They use this. They've grumbled about it. They've said, this is good. When it first came in, we had to do the entire, is it sending our code out of the building? Right? Is that, because that's quite an important thing, that I don't want our code being sent to GitHub to be analyzed, because it's all in private repos, and you pretty much said, we're not going to look inside private repos. So we did all that analysis, but the one thing I didn't do was use it myself, and now I'm doing a talk about it. So I thought, I need some authoritative views. Instead of anecdotal, my team said. So I looked up some stuff from ThoughtWorks. So ThoughtWorks will put a load of time into this, because they'll have customers saying, we need to use GenAI. They've got a technology radar. They have kind of people who think about this. It's their job to do it. It's my job to get a talk in a session so I get flown to Oslo and I can buy some more Smash. That's pretty much what my life is. So what they found, and this was a blog by Brigitte Bukella and Ryan Murray. There's an umlaut over that O, so it's definitely not O. You can get a 10 to 30% increase in productivity. But, and they did do a but on it, you need developers who know what they're doing. So they need to know what to ask for. And if anyone used to use the MSDN library when it was on CDs, you had to get in the mind of the people who wrote the MSDN library to work out the keywords that would get you the data back, because it had no really good search facility. And you became a wizard by knowing how to search the MSDN library. Same thing with Copilot. You have to ask it the right question to get the answer you think you're going to want, and you'll learn that. And they require human inputs. So you need to prompt it correctly and ask the right things and realize when it's actually generating garbage. And in fact, quite a few developers I've talked to said, you do it for 3 or 4 lines of code, you don't do it for any more than that. Any more than that, it's going to just lead you astray, because it will write it writes way too much and starts drifting away from the problem you're trying to solve. So it's great for well-defined problems, but it gets weird when you expand the problem and it becomes more complex. And the reality is, I would assume that most of the people in this room are working on complex problems, because otherwise your problem would be done by someone in Tata in India, right? So you're working with complex stuff with customers who are rubbish at defining what they want, and it's hard to get, you have to tease it out of them, and you spend most of your time trying to get to that point and then write the code. So that is an issue. And it concluded, it can reduce repetitive work. It allows you for more complete thinking earlier. So it can actually give you ideas that you don't research, and you will actually research them earlier and faster, which is always good, because I've always got this concept called product roadkill, is you kill off things as fast as possible. So you spike things, you do research, and immediately it's not worth it, you just kill it. Right? That's so much nicer than, I've written this code, it must carry on because I've spent days writing it, I can't possibly throw it away. At times, it's better to throw it away. Right? and finding information just in time. So the kind of conclusion is the problem is errors and hallucinations. It's the code being wrong, getting slightly the wrong grasp of what you were trying to do. And if you don't have mature coding practices and procedures, and you don't have people reviewing code or it becomes much worse. Because now people are just relying on it, especially if they're under pressure to get a feature out, or there's an error in the code, we need it fixed really fast. That's probably the time you need to back away from Copilot and think slower. And then one of the developers, Bruno Belate, he actually did a load of work trying it with Go. So he didn't do one of the common .NET languages that I know, he did it in Go, and he reckoned it requires quite a bit of effort, but it's really rewarding when it works. It's more time-consuming to kind of use it than just going with the flow of writing a standard Go program, and it really hampers TDD, because it tends to give you the solution, not the tests to design the solution that you do. If you're a TDD person, it's quite tricky, and if it suggests data, really bad news. Now, in the branding of Copilot, everything's Copilot now, Microsoft launched copilot.microsoft.com, and we're doing a security audit in February, and I knew this talk was coming up, so I decided to ask copilot.microsoft.com what reasons are there against using Copilot in Visual Studio, and it went and told me, here it comes. So it starts telling me, and I'm going, oh yeah, I would have possibly talked about that, and maybe I'm going to talk about this next bit. Obviously, what's happening here is ChatGPT has gone off to its library of information, and what it's found is there are loads of people, probably on Twitter, in blogs, writing articles, who are old, grumpy, middle-aged men, probably, who are saying, I don't like Copilot, and here's the reasons I don't like Copilot. And they've written lots of those articles compared to the people who probably did positive things about Copilot, so it's got loads of data to slag itself off, right? Pretty much. So it's really weird, because what you're getting here is the most common words next to the common word when you ask something like, why shouldn't I use Copilot? And it's analyzing all those blogs and bringing all those feeds in. Interesting that you can get Copilot to tell you why not to use Copilot. It's one of those things. So it's kind of, where does AI go next? So you get ludicrous articles coming out. So you will get the comment that there is AI software engineers will be a thing. You won't need real human engineers anymore. So one of the companies out there, Cognition AI, their headline is, we've got Devin, the first AI software engineer. It's like, yes. And they've written it in a monospace typed font that I couldn't even load. It's an IBM font that's available in the browser, but it isn't available in PowerPoint. But it looks a bit like that. And then in the first paragraph, they say, Devin is a tireless, skilled teammate, equally ready to build alongside you or independently complete tasks for you to review. If you analyze that, what does it really mean? It says it's not a software engineer because it needs a human to bloody well look at everything it does. That line admits completely you should never use this without someone looking at the code. That's what that says. So it's Copilot, because all these solutions still need a human software engineer to evaluate what the output is. They all say it. They all warn about this. They're all really clear with warnings saying, our code could be wrong. It's not our fault. Go and check it. It's your own job. If the PLA has put some malicious script into hundreds of public GitHub repositories, it's not our fault. Now, if AI is trained on existing code, and new code starts to all be generated by AI, will this stop programming and software engineering moving forward? Does that mean no new frameworks? Will that mean no new JavaScript frameworks? Yes, please stop. Will there be no new languages? Would you have got C#? Would you have got Go? Would you have got PHP? Would you only have PHP? Imagine that. Horror of the world. And this is the same worry they've got in Hollywood, because they're worried that if you use AI to generate scripts, and all the scripts are AI generated, and AI is using those scripts to work out what to write, it's all going to just go in a vicious circle and just spin and spin in a monoculture. And if you want to see what AI could do, how that would transform, you just need to look at the Marvel Universe series films, because that's what they did with people, even without the power of AI. Right. So from wearedevelopers.com, there's a concern about AI replacing some jobs or certain tasks. But it's very unlikely to replace high-value developers with comprehensive and innovative skills, which probably means everyone in this room, because none of us are... How many people are like 21-year-olds really haven't programmed much? Yeah, because it's not that kind of conference. So we're all sorted, isn't it? Right? Because we're all the greybeards who can carry on. So it's fine, it's fine. It's like, year 2000 problem, all our clocks are going to turn on 2039. 15 years away, but I'll be retired still. So I don't give a crap if it all goes wrong in 2039, which is the other date that everyone should be worried about. So what are we going to lose? That's the point. So we could get faster coding. We will be giving up slower coding. I like slower coding. I like to code slower. I would, in fact, normally when I have a problem where I would be coding, don't do it much anymore, so they just think I'm old and slow, and that's why this happens. But I tend to think a lot about what I'm about to code before I code it, so I code once, and it's possibly correct-ish. Because if code costs time and money, you do more design up front. Because the code is the expensive bit, so the more you shift left and do more design up front and more testing up front, the less code you write. And if we create less code, the code will have less bugs, because bugs pretty much track how much code you've got. And it will be easier to maintain and easier to understand, especially because people wrote it, not generated it, so they understand how they wrote it. They might leave the company, and someone else has to understand how they write it. It's not even that. It might be 6 months since they last coded that. They now don't understand it. Comments are actually a good thing in code, by the way, because it helps you remember what you did 6 years ago when you were an idiot. Okay? But you get this knowledge, this innate understanding of what we've written, and you get transferable skills. I don't like CVs that ask for knowledge of loads of frameworks. What you should ask for is, do you know a mocking framework, not do you know N substitute or N mock. You don't need to care which mocking framework they have. You don't even care if they wrote their own. As long as you understand the concepts, that's what you're after. So the worry is that Copilot or a GenAI solution could go, this is the most popular framework, everything should be written in this. So it's like going to your boss and going, I think we're going to write internal code, probably for internal users. We'll write that in Blazor so the back-end guys can write it, and we can do all the internal stuff in Blazor and web pages. And it'll look a bit bland, and it's not very sexy, but it'll work. And our internal users don't care. They just want to use the functionality and set things up and configure things. The customers can have everything in React. But if you ask Copilot, it probably would try to do React at the back, because that's the most popular web framework. Why wouldn't you use that at the back end? Because my skill sets are different. I prefer to have Blazor, because that's what the back-end developers can develop in seconds. And what about training, mentoring, pairing? So this is the bit of the industry. We're all senior. We're all greybeards, you know? Or we need highlights or whatever it is. So what are we going to do for the next generation if all we're going to do is gen code with AI? Well, training, we need the high-value developers to validate GenAI, and we need to pass that validation into junior developers' heads so they can be the high-value developers who can check GenAI-generated code in the future. And they're not going to do that if they just use GenAI and that's it, and we don't help them. Mentoring less experienced developers, I fundamentally believe, is one of the most enjoyable aspects of being a developer. The most satisfying thing you can do as a teacher mentorer is mentor someone and see them be a better programmer than you and piss off somewhere else, which happened to one of our guys at Huddle, went to Stack Overflow, absolute genius, superb, and we even got him to talk at conferences and stuff like that. And it's really satisfying, and that's what teachers do all the time. Teachers at schools see people who are brighter than them all the time, and their job is they love to see them succeed and go further than that teacher, and that's such an enjoyable thing. And we can mentor on the use of GenAI just as much as we're probably teaching people software architecture, techniques, specific frameworks, maybe stateless things on the web and architecture in general. And pairing. People keep saying things like Copilot are your pair programmer. They are absolutely not a pair programmer. They are a nice step-to-by guide, but it's not going to understand the business case. Isn't going to be trivial to challenge its assumptions. You're going to learn how to have to phrase things, give it more context. There's never going to fight back, because if you say, you're wrong, I really need it to do this, it will go, OK, do that. Whereas if you pair programming with someone who's two senior devs, you go, no, I think we should do it that way. The general reaction initially is probably, yeah, you're talking crap. There's no way it'll work. And then you discuss why it would work, and then you eventually get to the point where, you know what, that would actually work. Just going to get my photo taken, so I'm taking my sleeves down. And the other thing that Copilot won't do is Copilot is not going to answer its mobile phone at 2 a.m. in the morning when your customer has a real issue. And that you've got to look in the logs and look in the code and work out why there's a real issue in your software and what's going wrong. So you'd hope that we're not going to have someone answer at 2 in the morning that's this robotic voice. What you want is, I had a few drinks. I'll just answer in a second. Right? Which generally is what happens if you hit a developer at 2 in the morning. I did once do support at GMTV. I'd had 2 bottles of red wine. I told them that. They had their wire servers news feeds reset by accident by me. But they were warned. Right? But pairing, mentoring, train, all of this creates a team, a shared knowledge, a shared purpose. It enhances how you think about the product, how you're going to deliver that software. You're thinking about the customer. You're thinking about how the support team are going to work with your software, and it should enable you to do better customer support. So that's why I think we've got this danger that we lose that training, mentoring, pairing, because we don't want to code fast. We want to code slow. And Martin Mazur did a talk about generative AI yesterday and code generation, and said, most developers aren't spending their time writing code. They might spend about 4 hours a day out of an 8-hour day writing code. They're otherwise writing specifications, documents, going to meetings, helping other people. That means if you save 50% of their time by using GenAI, you save 2 hours a day. That's all you're going to save. And there's a backlog with loads of work. 2 hours a day is quite handy, because it's probably a whole chunk of work they could do. But it's not the silver bullet that means we can do twice as much code, because developers aren't coding most of the time. That's the reality of their job. So it's important we don't lose that. So yes, so I'm going to end 10 minutes early, because I will now claim that I did this on purpose so I can get questions and have a discussion with the audience. But I've talked really fast. So if only I had a hammer, or maybe I don't want a hammer. Oops. Gone one too far. Maybe I want a drill. Now, I could have gone for a normal screwdriver, which is more analogous to the hammer, but I don't want that because we've all got drills. Why would I go for a normal screwdriver? What you want is a decent drill to go through wood, because that's much easier, and then I don't need to drill a pilot hole, and I can split the plank. Right? Because that's what happens when you drill big screws through wood. Interestingly, it did realize it's a hand holding a drill. It didn't know it's a screw. It just said a hand holding a drill this time, did PowerPoint. What it missed is not only is it drill, it's also a hammer, because that's actually a hammer drill. So it could be used as a hammer. But there you are. So yes, so I don't want us not to use powerful tools. I'm not saying go back to a screwdriver. I'm saying we should use Copilot. We should learn how it works. You should actually, if you find out, hey, here's the best way of using it, do it as a session in your company. Tell other people how it should work. And Adam Kogan was saying they've got rules about how you should use it and work with it and give people hints on how to use it. And if you do that, we can make it the tool that helps us get rid of the boring stuff, but make sure we keep training people, educating people, and doing all the actual fun social things that make development a wonderful place to work. Okay, well, that's me. Has anyone got any questions or opinions? No opinions. This is really weird. Go for it. Okay, so the question is, I'll try and remember this. How do we feel, and this can be anyone in the audience, about the fact that Microsoft just ran a code analysis tool on every public repository in GitHub and rode a cart and horses through all the licensing agreements that were probably in those repositories saying you're not really meant to do this without asking? Is anyone upset about that? How does people feel about that? Anyone? You're upset about it, I would hope. Yeah. Yeah, so I think the argument is, who, by the way, got the email from Instagram saying, by the way, we're going to index all your shit? It happened a week ago, did it? Did anyone go off and challenge it? How arcane was that process? Well, no, I didn't say it wasn't easy. It was arcane. You went to a web form and had to give an explicit reason why you thought you should be excluded from the data set. And it was done in the most lo-fi web tech I've seen in a long time. No CSS, no nice looking stuff. It was, hey, you've got to have a reason for this. And my reason was GDPR, stop it now. Right? That's the reason, because you're not allowed to do this. You're genuinely not allowed to do this. But they've actually said you have to have a reason. So the point is, a handful of people have challenged that Instagram, and they will challenge stuff like, you can't use my faces, you can't do this, you can't do that. Tends to be more older people who are going to object to this. You'll talk to the mid-20s who won't care, because they already think it's out of the bag. But if we think it's objectionable to do it in Instagram, why is it not objectionable to do it in code? And the other one is, it's clearly wrong to just rip off people's music and create new music from it, isn't it? Like, I think most people would say you're not meant to just nick people's music and voices. You're not meant to nick Scarlett Johansson because she said no to you, and then use someone who does Scarlett Johansson impressions effectively, and then use that. That's a bit weird. That's a bit incelish, right? Oh, she said no to me. I'll now make a fake of her. What a moron. Right. And that's the point. So the question is this benefiting everyone? The tricky bit I have, and this was the point I made, is Copilot, the argument is it will never reproduce exactly what was in your repo, but that's a lie because it can. Right? And we all know it can. So this is the point at which, do you start writing licenses more strictly? Can you do opt-outs? You don't want to kill open source just because it's going to be used in Copilot and things like that. And I don't think we've got the balance yet.
Isn't it kind of the same problem we had with search engines when they started being a thing?
Yeah.
They crawled their entire web, not looking at anything there, and then we started out having the robot.txt file.
Yeah.
We assume good companies will adhere to what it says, but we can't really do anything about it.
Yes. So the comparison here is to search engines that used to take everything in the world and just plonk it in front of someone and not send to that site. And you could put robots.txt, but we don't have that with Copilot yet. I can't say, please exclude me.
The difference with the search engines is that they lead traffic to the original source. Copilot does not.
No, you're right. So Copilot The argument you will get from Copilot, and this is a devil's advocate type thing, is we can't lead you to the source because there is no source because we haven't got a source, we've anonymized everything and we've promised not to do things in verbatim, so I can't point you at the original source because I don't know where it is. Genuinely, they might not actually know where it is properly, but all they knew was statistically this word, this word, this word, this word, and they'd have to go, and if I take all these words and just go to original, did it look like that? But they may not have kept the data like that in the first place because they ingested it and just put it as words next to words and then threw away what the original was. Don't know how they store the data. If I was them, I wouldn't store the original. I would just store the results of the analysis of the text because that's so much cheaper and faster to do. So it might be very hard to point at the original. And this is the weird thing about GenAI being used in search queries is there's two reasons that Google don't want to do real stuff like Copilot does in Bing, is because it doesn't take you to the original site. So they can't do ad clicks to it. If they give you the answer immediately, the value to advertisers being anywhere near that is nil, almost. The other thing is that a GenAI search takes so much more power than a Google search. Like it's 100,000 times the cost in electricity and computational power. So you now have something that's vastly more expensive that can't send anyone to an advert. Which is just freaky that Google don't want to do it. Yeah.
But they're putting basically gates around something that was public knowledge before, saying this is now the new source of truth. Everyone starts using that source of truth, then they start charging for it once we're all dependent on it.
Yes, and that is the worry, that they will start charging really hard for that analysis because it costs real money to maintain it. And I think that is a danger. So you don't want that. So that's the issue. And the reason Microsoft does it in Bing is because Bing doesn't have a big search market. So it doesn't give a crap, right? Because it can jeopardize the whole of search and it wouldn't bother it. Whereas Google rely on search, they're quite concerned about this as an existential crisis that they could have. The only thing that Google's got going for it is ChatGPT and the GenAI things come out with so much crap, like genuinely, if you're not careful, you don't get the right answers. And Adam Kogan had GenAI doing multiplication sums and getting them wrong. And you have to tell it, use a script to do calculations, and then suddenly it goes off and does something very different and gets the right values. And if you go into Google now and go 341 times 28, you get the right answer. And if you go into ChatGPT, you might not. Right? Which is really weird, because we've got used to the idea in a search box, you can just do calculations, and you might not be able to do that. But you're quite right. You could end up with a walled garden because of GitHub. And I think these are real concerns, and we don't want to have a closed source ecosystem, and you don't really want to say, right, everything can't be scanned and made better, because as a proud developer in an open source project, you'd like people to take your code and good ideas, but give you the credit. And one of the worst things we have in our industry, and I think Dylan Beattie may have opined to it yesterday, is we don't pay open source people money properly. We don't pay for open source projects. So Docker Desktop is now a paid for product. So someone in the company was spotted, it's now paid for. What are we going to do? Because we kind of use it and we're starting to rely on it a bit. And are we under the revenue thing? And they said, no. And I went, that's fine. I go, so we just need to buy licenses for it. And then at least 3 developers said, no, you could use this, you could use this, you could use it under WSL, there's something else that can, replace it, therefore we can get it for free. And I actually genuinely asked them the question, you do know it's only about $5 per user per month. We should pay for this because someone's written it. And someone said, yeah, but this is better. And I'm thinking, none of them got the irony that they, as software developers, argued that software developers shouldn't be paid. That's what they were doing, right? And this wasn't a case of the company won't pay it. The company will pay that. There is no problem paying that. That is nothing in the costs that we have in Azure. So I think developers themselves have to get real about how you support an open source ecosystem beyond even Copilot. So, yeah. Anyway, thank you for adding to the talk and giving a bit of context at the end. So, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it and enjoy the rest of NDC. Remember to vote. There's only green tickets out there, apparently.